which is it's a professional film that a film company called Tapestry have made.
Yeah.
And the schools get to it via our Holocaust Learning UK website.
Okay.
And
so you're keeping things going.
We're keeping things going. I think we will probably have something like maybe 5, 6, even 7 times the number of students that we normally have, because it's going out not only across the country but into the States and Israel, and quite global. And the comments so far have been absolutely phenomenal.
Oh, terrific!
I think it's really good. So what's interesting is there is a survivor speaking, a lady called Janine Weber, who's very good. She was more of a hidden child than a camp survivor.
Yeah.
But they've gone through the whole of our workshop presentation, and so that the students get the same chronological experience that they would if they were doing a workshop. And then also they've used student actors who have read the lines of certain survivors who would have been about the same age as them.
Yeah, wow.
So it's really fab. Really fab.
Okay, thanks, Bernice. If everybody could mute themselves now except David and myself. We're at the witching hour. Tremendous turnout. It shows the grip. We've got 53 computers on, so that's probably close to 90 people, I would think. I can see we've got, it's nice to see, always good to see Valerie in Netanya. And Valerie just shared with us. You can unmute, please mute Valerie. It's good to see you. I didn't realize that dear David's twin brother and sister were part of the Mengele experiments. Horrifying to hear that. And I can see a whole bunch of people on who've been doing speaking for us at different times. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's with enormous pleasure that I welcome David Marwell from just outside the White House, as it were, 7 miles away. He and I were watching what's going on in America, where to a degree, there is a little bit of a triumph of democracy with somebody being held accountable for their deeds, nothing to compare, chas v'chalila, with Mengele, but showing that democracies can hold people to account. And that's quite something. This is the third of our series about Holocaust Memorial Day, but it also fits in because starting on last Sunday and ending up in 4 weeks' time, we're running a sequence on the criminal justice system in the UK, or England, I should say. God forbid there used to be a UK, but that's gone now. So the criminal justice system in England, we had a forensic psychiatrist on Sunday. David is, in every sense of the word, having read his book, a forensic historian, an investigator. I mean, that's all historians are supposed to be. But if you get this book, and it is, I have to say, a very, very difficult read. Not the way he's written it, but it's the first part of the book is painful, emotionally painful, but it needs to be read. And then what David only did to try and bring Mengele to justice and to confirm whether he was in fact alive or dead, because I'm sure many people will remember there was a lot of dispute. I remember all the things. We've seen him in Paraguay, we've seen him in Argentina, we've seen him in Brazil. You didn't know whether this bloke was alive or dead or what was going on, and you so much wanted him to be brought to justice. David, just give us a little bit of background about yourself, where you grew up, how on earth you came to be doing an enormous amount of Holocaust stuff, and then right at the end, we're going to look at have you talk about the Kennedy papers, and you're going to tell us who actually killed JFK. Okay, so.
Well, that might be dangerous for you. Well, thank you for suggesting that I've grown up at all. But to the extent that I've grown up, it was in around New York City. I attended Brandeis University for my undergraduate work, and State University of New York for my doctorate in modern European history. But while I was still writing my dissertation, I got a job with the Department of Justice as a historian in the Nazi War Crimes Unit, the Office of Special Investigations, and we worked very closely with a similar unit that you started in England, and I got to know the staff of that unit quite well. Worked closely with them.
Was that a government department, David?
Yes, it was associated with your Ministry of Justice and Scotland Yard.
Yeah.
And it was through that work that I was assigned to the Josef Mengele investigation in 1985. Initially, we were charged with the task of investigating whether Mengele had any connection with U.S. Institutions or personnel, but it quickly developed into a international manhunt where we joined with the Israelis and the Germans to try to find Mengele. So that's by way of short introduction.
Okay,
I should say, though, just given the audience here, that while I was still in high school, I spent the summer of 1968 in London in a theater program where we initiated the then new theater at the University College London on Gower Place.
Oh, it's a fabulous theater.
And
we were the
first production, and I lived in Hampstead near the Belsize Park tube station at Mrs. Bagwell's bed and breakfast for £1 a night.
Sounds fantastic.
And I have great memories of having lived there. Yeah.
Okay, so so that it doesn't get lost right at the end, I just wanted you for a couple of minutes to talk about the website Jewish Gen, which I believe you have some involvement with. I know there are members of our community who are very interested to trace their ancestry, and it's a website I've been using ever since I had to write my children's family history projects for school.
You did that too, huh?
Yeah. Let's call a spade a spade. Yeah. The goal was to get better marks than my friends. So tell us about
I did that with the science project. Well, after I served in the Department of Justice, I had a series of quite interesting positions. The last of which was the director of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City, where I served for about 15 years. And sometime around 2003, 2004, I think, we became aware of Jewish Gen, this really wonderful website, genealogy website, and that focuses on Jewish genealogy. And the museum, Jewish Gen was at a very difficult time in its history, and the museum came in and actually took over Jewish Gen. And Jewish Gen became a part of the museum, where we provided professional administration and fundraising, and were able to stabilize and help to improve Jewish Gen. And so I've been interested in it since maybe for the last 25 years or so, 15 years or so. And it's, if you're interested in
I've just put it up on the screen, David. Yeah. One of the fabulous databases on it is what's called Jewish Gen Family Finder. And yeah. I don't know if it's live or just a screen. Hold on, let's find out. No, I can look and see who was looking for people who had the same surname as my family. I don't have to spell it exactly. I can see, you can put it in sounds like, and I had the town, so I could do that. So, and that's
really a remarkable tool. It brings families together. That we have countless stories of families who discovered lost relatives or unknown relatives through posting on the Family Finder. And it's an example of how the internet actually created a new way for genealogy to be conducted. So Jewish Gen has the largest collection of data relating to Jewish family history. And it's really a remarkable thing. It's absolutely free for anyone who wants to use it. If you want to get some enhanced capabilities, and it'll cost you, I think, $100 a year. But it's really quite, and it's almost entirely run by volunteers.
It is a remarkable thing. I'm just showing here who was looking for my family. One of them was a cousin I knew from long ago, and one of them was somebody I linked up with through Jewish Gen, and I'm still in touch with, tracking the family history. We're still looking for the Dolowich millions, which we know are hidden somewhere in Poland, if only we could find them. But there's all kinds of databases on there with just you can just search for every Dolowich or every whatever you want to, Epstein or whatever you want to. It's fantastic. Okay, so thank you. And why do you think how do you relate that at all to the kind of work that you've been doing?
What, Jewish Gen?
Yeah, in terms of the Holocaust work that you've done over the years.
Well, I mean, I've been involved with the study of the Holocaust and kind of my career has almost entirely been in public history. That is, as a well-trained historian, but I've served in public institutions at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum with the Department of Justice. I was the director of the Berlin Document Center in Berlin, which was the repository archive of all the captured Nazi personnel-related records. And I think that, and then I had my short side trip into the Kennedy assassination.
Okay, we'll get to that at the end.
Yeah.
So let's get to the lamentable narrative of Dr. Josef Mengele. And I wanted you to, I'm going to let you just run for about 15, 20 minutes on Mengele's early years and the grip of eugenics on German science. It wasn't exclusively German. Eugenics started in England with Francis Galton, really. And I remember traces of it left over from university, anthropology lecturers who were talking about Black people like they were, frankly, dirt and inferior people, although they didn't end up murderers, I have to say. So let's talk about what you learned about Mengele's early years and the grip of eugenics in Germany.
If I might just make a sort of introductory comment about but my interest in Mengele and why I wrote the book, and then I'll move into his early years. You know, I left the museum in Manhattan on the last day of 2015. So I began the book on the first day of 2016, and I initially was planning to write a book about the investigation, which is essentially the second half of the book now.
Yeah.
But I had, in beginning to write the introductory chapter about who Mengele was, I became aware of a whole range of new sources about Josef Mengele and of new scholarship about him that had come out since 2000 or a bit earlier. And this forced me actually to reconsider the project and to decide to write a biography of him, which would include my own involvement in his the search and eventual identification of his body. So I often say that if you are looking for traces of the man that Mengele would later become, the Auschwitz doctor, you will have very hard time finding those traces in his childhood. Now, there aren't a great deal of sources available on his childhood, but there are no hints. There are no stories of Mengele, murdering cats in the backyard or being a bully at school or acting in any way that would have tipped you off to the extreme nature of his activities later on. He was born as the first of three sons into a very prosperous family in the town of Günzburg in Bavaria. His father had founded and ran a kind of engineering firm. They made a manufacturing firm. They made farm equipment. Started off by making wagons and later other mechanical farm machinery. And the family firm became the largest employer in the town, and the town was essentially a company town, and the Mengele company was the company. So he grew up with some privilege, prosperous family, conservative, Catholic. Mengele was a middling student in secondary school, got middling marks, nothing to suggest his future interest and passion for science or his future success in the profession that he chose. It really wasn't until he got to university when a number of things happened which really set the course of his life. Quite early on in his career, he became...
Sorry, David, could I just ask a question? Because I don't think I saw it in the book. Were there Jews in Günzburg?
There were some Jews in Günzburg, not a great deal.
And presumably not a community that stood out? Hasidic, Haredi, you could really see who was who?
No, I think there were some of his teachers at the gymnasium may have been Jewish, but he did encounter, of course, Jews when he went to Munich in April 1930 for the summer semester at the University of Munich. And quite early on, he decided that he wanted to study medicine. Initially, he thought he might study dentistry, but he ended up studying medicine. He had a privileged and elite education. He had a number of either current or future Nobel laureates as his professors. He became engaged quite early in the study of medicine and related disciplines in genetics and in anthropology. He actually got two advanced degrees, one in anthropology, a PhD in anthropology, and then not only his medical degree, meaning that he could practice medicine and his license, but he also got an advanced degree in medicine, a PhD in medicine, which would have set him on a course for a university career as a professor or as a head of an institute. So I read all of the papers that he published in journals. I read his 2 dissertations, his book reviews in journals. He was considered a bright light, a quite promising student with a quite bright future in the discipline. And had the war not happened, had his life not taken on the course that it did, he probably would have ended up having a reasonable career as an academic, perhaps maybe a little bit nasty professor at university or the head of some institute. But when he began his studies in earnest in the 1930, 31, 32, 1933, when he began working very closely with Theodor Mollison, who was his mentor in anthropology, it was at the time that the Nazis actually took power in Germany. And you ended up with the study that became the core of Mengele's intellectual passion, the study of medicine and of anthropology. That science, the science that he studied, became a key fundament for Nazi ideology. Himmler once said that that National Socialism was simply biology, applied biology, and in many ways that was the case. So that you ended up with this kind of symbiotic relationship between the science that Mengele studied, practiced, and excelled at, becoming having its status elevated with the Nazi state, supporting an intellectual foundation for Nazi racial science, and enjoying correspondingly this elevated status. And what does elevated status mean for a discipline? It means better funding from the research foundations and institutes, more status for the people who practice it, the elevation of the curriculum, and the importance of its study. So it's this kind of confluence of the politics and of Mengele's interest in science kind of came together in the early 1930s, and he became, in a sense, a kind of biological soldier for the Third Reich by studying and publishing and researching in the science that provided the intellectual framework for much of Nazi ideology.
Can I just pick up for people will have heard of anthropology. Some people may have had kids who studied it at university, but there are 2 more or less completely separate branches of anthropology. One is social anthropology, it's the study of social structures, and the other is physical anthropology. And if you could just talk about that, because clearly that was where Mengele went.
Physical anthropology, Mengele's mentor, Theodor Mollison, was one of the great proponents of physical anthropology. And in fact, physical anthropology became, in the Nazi period, really racial hygiene. That is the identification of racial characteristics and the protection of racial quality, the fostering of policies that would create a safe environment for the advancement of the German race, and a corresponding set of policies that would disadvantage other believed to be inferior races. And Mengele was really at the cutting edge of that field.
Yeah. So in this pseudoscience of eugenics, if you could clarify how the Germans, the Nazis, saw human beings and saw the German Volk compared to everybody else.
So you use a very important term, the German word Volk, which is very difficult to translate into English. It has a kind of mystical connotation. It really means, it's sometimes translated as race, sometimes as racial community. It has this concept both of a kind of peoplehood and of a racial quality. And it was Mengele, as a physician and as an anthropologist, was considered his responsibility to further the folk, to do research that would define who was a member of the racial community and who wasn't, and to support policies that advantaged one and not the other. So eugenics involves not only science but also social policy, and under the Nazis, the German race, or the Aryan race, or the races that made up the different racial groups that made up the Aryan people, enjoyed a very high status. They were considered to be the creators of culture, and it was the responsibility of German science and German physicians to protect the blood of the folk, to prevent it from being contaminated through sexual relations with people who were not members of that racial group, and at the same time, on the flip side, to disadvantage and to expel from the body politic and eventually from life itself those who represented inferior races, who were, in the Nazi worldview, culture destroyers, who had a nefarious impact on the general good. So one might ask, how was a Nazi physician able to be true in their own mind to their Hippocratic oath, and at the same time advocate the destruction of certain individuals? And this was done through a kind of intellectual and ethical sleight of hand. If the responsibility of the physician under the Nazi view was not the care of an individual person, but rather the care of the folk, of the body politic, of the racial body. So that, and the metaphor they use, if it's completely consistent with good medical practice to remove a diseased cell from a body in order to save the body. You excise a cancer in order to allow the body to survive. And that same metaphor was used in terms of the racial body of the people. That is, you can exclude certain people who have a nefarious impact on the body itself. You can, if an arm is diseased, you can cut off a limb to save the body. And so this metaphor was extended to the population, so that a German physician's responsibility was not to care for the patient in front of him, but to care for this theoretical, emotional, kind of mythical racial body.
So if one compares or contrasts him, the Nazis, Hitler and all the people that briefly joined in with the other mass murderers of the 20th century, Stalin and Mao Zedong, their metaphor was not biological. This was a war of privilege against underprivilege, and the end result was the same, killing huge numbers of people. And often it was by ethnicity, because as we know, we were considered the bourgeois, some cosmopolitans under the communists. And Pol Pot went after the middle class because to excise that. but this was the most strikingly biological
Absolutely.
of a populist.
Which is why Jews could not convert from Judaism in order to save themselves as they could during the Inquisition. That you were a Jew by virtue of the blood that coursed through your veins. There's nothing you could do, not conversion, not going to a different house of worship on Sunday. You were a Jew because of the we would say today of your DNA and not of the content of your heart, but of the content of your blood vessels.
So one of the many amazing narratives in your book is this importance of having purity, which of course we know had a side effect. We weren't the only group destined for destruction, the learning disabled, the physically disabled. I was amazed to read that there was a proper biological check made of any lady who would marry an SS officer.
Yes, I mean, the SS, the SS was conceived of in a way as a kind of state-sponsored breeding project. If you were an SS man, by virtue of getting into the SS, you had to pass certain not only physical, but also racial tests. You had to submit yourself for a racial examination. If you wanted to marry and you wanted your marriage to be sanctioned and approved by the SS, then your bride had to also submit themselves to the same kind of examination. Interestingly enough, Mengele was, as a racial scientist, was trained to do these racial evaluations and often did them on behalf of the court in cases where it might have figured in a criminal case, whether someone was a Jew or not. He would make the decision based on this evaluation, whether a person was Jewish or not Jewish, based on their physical characteristics.
So what physical characteristics was he looking for as a tip-top scientist?
Yeah, there was a whole catalog of physical characteristics that were evaluated through observation, through comparison. You know, they would check the color of the eye. They'd have different chips of glass that were different colors, and they would measure against the eye to see what color it was. Color of the hair, the type of hair, the person's stature, their posture. There were lots of values for the eyes and the eyelids, the nose, how broad it is, how prominent it is, and its shape, the lips, and there was a whole scorecard that was set up. When I was the director of the Berlin Document Center, we had one of our big collections was the collection of the Nazi Immigration Office, which evaluated ethnic Germans. Those are people who were born outside of Germany who had a claim on German background, and they applied during the war for German citizenship, but they had to be evaluated on their racial characteristics to see whether they were actually of an appropriate race or not, or appropriate racial mixture. And there was a kind of schematic scorecard with a matrix on it, and the evaluator would check all of these 20 different characteristics and different values associated with them in order to decide the person's future.
So Mengele was doing this stuff before the war broke out.
Yeah, he was working for the Institute in Frankfurt as a racial evaluator. He also worked for this immigration office later on in Poland when the war first began, in occupied Poland. So he was a practitioner. He was also, he wrote scientific papers, published them in good journals at the time. I found a reference to one of his dissertations in a Japanese journal in the 1970s, and I think also a British dental journal.
Oh, yeah. So the point that we're establishing here, and I'm about to sneeze, I apologize.
Bless.
Thank you. This was not some freak sideshow Mengele's behavior, but it was intrinsic to German academia and to, sorry to use the language because we would reject it about ourselves, but German science, but how German science had been totally corrupted during the 30s. And, you're reading the of, these cards and characteristics. this was a huge bureaucratic performance and function. Other countries have checked us out, whether we were at shuls or be members of synagogues or whatever. You might even have people who have a look and say he looks Jewish, but this was a serious attempt to eventually classify everybody in Germany.
Yeah, and it was, you mentioned that the infrastructure that was necessary in order to support this was huge, and it took resources away from, one could argue from the German perspective, much more important, especially during the war, much more important activities that might have been a more practical effect for the Germans.
Well, Baruch Hashem for that then. So, so the war starts, and Dr. Josef Mengele is a trained doctor and an anthropologist. Where does he go?
So he joins a Waffen SS combat division. He joins probably at the end of 1940, probably December. It's a little difficult to date that precisely, but he's with the unit certainly in the spring of 1941. He's a combat physician. He's on the staff of the engineer battalion for the 5th Viking 5th SS division, which was a division made up of regiments from different Nordic countries. It was one of the first of the kind of non-German, were not entirely German Waffen SS units. And Mengele served in the engineers battalion as the battalion physician. And in that capacity, he was a normal army physician. He treated patients, cared for the members of the battalion, would treat them for illnesses, and would be responsible for their well-being, and also would treat certain war-related injuries and wounds if he was able to do that. Otherwise, they would go back to the field hospital, which was attached to the unit. So he joined this unit in the spring of 1941. He was with the unit at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, where they invaded. His unit was at the very south, in Army Group South, but the southern part of Army Group South, where they invaded or attacked Ukraine in June of 1941. And he was with the unit and remained with the unit for almost 18 months, until January 1943, when he was evacuated from the area around Stalingrad. This is you won't read that in other biographies of Mengele, because people make a fundamental mistake in understanding his service. Most people believe he was transferred out of that unit sometime in 1942, early 42 or mid 42. He actually remained with the unit for that entire period of time, for the 18 months. That unit was involved in the early days of the war against the Soviet Union in mass atrocity events in Ukraine. It's unclear and probably unlikely that Mengele took part in these events himself, but he was certainly aware of them. He was...
Sorry, David, just so I can clarify, just that I don't suppose anybody doubts it, but when you're talking about mass atrocities, you're talking about the mass shootings of Jews?
Mass shootings of Jews, yes. The Viking division was involved in a string of mass shootings, beginning within the first several days of the invasion and continuing for a while. We don't know how long exactly, but we have well-documented events in the first days of last days of June and the first days of July 1941.
So this wasn't hidden stuff. Any member of the SS, any army unit that was attached would literally have heard and seen what was going on.
Yes, I mean, in the book I describe the evidence around one of these shootings, and you have evidence from the war diaries of Wehrmacht units that are in the area that talk about these shootings, and you have testimony from police officers. It was pretty obvious and apparent to those who were there. As important as the mass atrocities were in terms of Mengele's own experience, was also this kind of unrelenting frontline combat. The engineer battalions were always the vanguard, because they were the units that went out to destroy, tank defenses and to build bridges to cross rivers. They were at the vanguard of the fighting divisions, and Mengele saw a lot of action, extreme action, for a very long time, with the pauses during the winter when they would winter over in their encampments, but beginning in the spring of 1942 and throughout the very deadly summer of 1942, where he ended up going down into the Caucasus, and eventually around Christmas time 1942, his unit is assigned to move out of the Caucasus and up towards Stalingrad to cover what they believed to be the rescue of the Sixth Army, and eventually, of course, the retreat of the other forces. And he ended up being flown out of that area in mid-January 1943.
So just to sort of absolutely bang this guy to a dartboard, he wasn't just like a doctor with a stethoscope hanging around him. He was a signed up member of the SS, who uniquely managed to avoid being picked up later on, because unlike other SS people, he didn't have his blood type.
He didn't have his blood type tattooed. Yes. Yeah.
So his medical responsibilities, and this will relate to a degree to his Auschwitz experience, what he was doing there. As a army doctor, military doctor, you've got wounds, you've got normal illnesses. You would also have to be very concerned about epidemiology, about the spread of disease, and good nutrition. Would that be part of what he had to do?
Yes. And it was a bit of a challenge for him. He wrote to his wife in early 1942 saying, I have the full range. I mean, he's dealing with a rather narrow part of the population. He's not dealing with older people, so he didn't have the issues related to age. He's dealing with all relatively fit young men, but there was a whole range of illnesses without the kind of clinical background that perhaps a normal physician, a practicing physician, would have had. He said, it's a little much for a racial scientist, he said. And he asked his wife actually to go to a used bookstore and send him a copy of one of the basic medical texts, like an equivalent to a dictionary, so that he could study up on some of the things that he wasn't really quite experienced with. But I think he was quite a bright guy, and he ended up probably, at least in terms of the performance appraisals he got from his unit commanders, he was quite an able physician in that area.
Did he have to do surgery?
I don't know. I don't know. I imagine that he would have had to have done minor surgery, but there was, of course, the field hospitals and the rear areas where people who were more seriously or more acutely ill. But he did have to do, I mean, he mentions this later in his own justifications for what he did at Auschwitz. He did have to practice the practice of triage, where he had to make decisions about who among the people that he was treating were most seriously ill or most acutely in need of care, and would treat them first and allow others not to be treated. And he uses that metaphor later on for part of his own kind of self-defense about what happened at Auschwitz.
This has a horrible modern ring, as doctors across the world in wards packed with COVID people are exactly
this rationing of care and this,
having to make these decisions. I mean, not with in the way that Mengele was, but I'm sure many doctors and nurses and healthcare workers are going to be experiencing some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, which Mengele didn't appear to have. So,
well, there's a question about that actually, which I tried to chase down, but there's one kind of telling note in the great book by Robert J. Lifton about Mengele called Nazi Doctors, where one of his colleagues at Auschwitz thought that he had the symptoms of being shell-shocked, and which of course is, I think, the old-fashioned term for PTSD. And I tried to chase that down, because there is an abrupt kind of discontinuity in not in Mengele's intellectual life, but in terms of how he behaved that could have been attributable to that. And he certainly was exposed to extreme violence for long periods of time, and that can have an impact on your personality.
Yeah. So how did he get from the Waffen-SS to Auschwitz?
Yeah, so he remained in the Waffen-SS because the guard units and the staffs at concentration camps were, for the most part, Waffen-SS personnel. When he was evacuated out of the Stalingrad area in the mid-1943, he went to Berlin. And in Berlin, he was able to rejoin or reacquaint himself with one of his mentors, the mentor for his medical dissertation, and the head of the institute, the University Institute in Frankfurt, where Mengele had served as an assistant before the war. This was a man named Ottmar von Verschuur, who ended up being a quite noted German geneticist even after the war. Von Verschuur had left Frankfurt in 1942 and had become the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology in Berlin. And Mengele was able to join up with his former mentor, and although he wasn't assigned officially to the institute, spent a lot of time there in the months of January, February, March, April, and May of 1943. He got to know the scientific staff. He got to know the experimental experiments that they were working on, and he was able to regain the warm association with Dr. von Verschuur. At the mid-May of 1943, one of the camp physicians at Auschwitz contracted scarlet fever, and they needed to replace him with someone. Mengele had the right background and the right rank, and it was in a replacement unit in the Waffen-SS. There's a unit that was staffed with people who could be assigned elsewhere, who was kind of between assignments. And Mengele was assigned to Auschwitz. We don't know whether he volunteered to go there. It's clear that going there was an advantage to him personally and also to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, because, and it's a bit complicated, but Mengele's appearance, his assignment to Auschwitz, permitted the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and its staff to continue and to re-engage in certain aspects of their science that they were not able to do since the beginning of the war. The most important example of that is the twin experiments. Before the war, well, first of all, many people misunderstand twin experiments. They believe it comes out of some kind of unhealthy interest in twins, some kind of pathological interest in twins. Some people believe that Mengele was involved in that the twin experiments at Auschwitz were engineered to try to discover the secret of twin births so that you could increase the German population. None of that is true. It ignores a number of things. First of all, the business about increasing the German birth rate. If you're interested in the secret of twin births, you would more likely look at the parents who give birth to twins rather than the twins themselves. And Mengele showed no apparent interest in the parents. But it also ignores the long tradition of twin experiments as the foundation of genetic research, not only in Germany, but throughout the world. And there was nothing inherently wrong about twin experiments.
Still goes on.
Still goes on. Mengele's, the twin experiments that were done at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, some of them were funded, some of it was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation in New York. There were 200 dissertations during the Nazi period between 1933 and 1945 that were based on twin experiments. It was, in Galton's terms, the gold standard of genetic research. The theory is you're looking both at identical twins and at fraternal twins. Identical twins have nearly the identical genetic makeup, and fraternal twins have the same genetic makeup as any two siblings might have. So it could be quite a lot, it could be not so much. But the fraternal twins have the identical prenatal environment. They have the same intrauterine environment. They're born to the same family. They have the same nutritional standards. So if you look at pathology and you look at the occurrence of a certain pathological disease or a disease, and you find that among identical twins, there's a very high concurrence, and among fraternal twins, there is a lower concurrence, then you might posit that that disease was linked somehow genetically, and that's the basic theory between for twin research. It's usually was engaged in terms of pathology to look for the secret of the origin of certain diseases or certain characteristics, and it developed even under the Nazi period in other areas. The problem is that you had to have, especially before the war and under then current German medical ethical practices, you had to have you couldn't dragoon people into being experimented on. Sometimes the experiments were painful or uncomfortable. You had to convince them to do it. It was expensive. You had to locate the twins. You had to, and sometimes entice them with rewards to take part in these twin experiments. Most twin experiments were done on children because you needed intact pairs of twins. And when people get older, twin pairs occasionally diverge. And so when the war, especially as the war went on, children were removed from the cities, away from research centers. They weren't available for twin research. And many twin experiments ground to a halt because there was no source of twins. When Mengele arrives at Auschwitz, he has before him an almost unlimited supply of twins. If the incidence of twins is 1.5 to 2% of natural births, and Mengele encountered 750,000 people coming through Auschwitz during his tenure there, you can imagine, just do the math and you figure out how many twins likely were available for research. So his assignment to Auschwitz was really serendipitous, if not intentional. And it allowed him, it provided him with a tremendous source of opportunity to practice science, not only because he had this unheard of supply of twin material, to use a very kind of sterile term, but he also didn't have to worry about the safeguards that would have normally applied to German citizens before the war, and the ethical standards that were applied even under the Nazis early on for German human research. But he also had at his disposal a tremendous reservoir of medical and scientific talent. If you imagine the people with scientific training who were forced out of the rail cars that arrived at Auschwitz during the period that Mengele was there. You had world famous anthropologists, world famous pediatricians, world famous pathologists. You had artists, medical drafts people, you had medical technicians, you had nurses, you had the whole range of scientific talent. And Mengele not only recruited, using air quotes, subjects for his medical research, but he also recruited people who would assist him, who could assist him in his research. And he established at Auschwitz a kind of twin, in a way, pardon the phrase, to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute that he had left in Berlin, modeled on the same kind of standards. First-rate scientific minds who were, he would say, whom he recruited to work with him, but they really were given the devil's choice between working with him and a far more sinister fate. And then this kind of unlimited supply of, or nearly unlimited supply of subjects. Not only was he interested in twins, he was also interested in growth anomalies. He was interested in dwarfism and gigantism. He was interested in other kinds of anomalous physical features, hair lips, club feet, and he was a kind of advanced or reconnaissance for his colleagues at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and other medical institutes. He supplied samples of physical abnormalities for research to different research institutions. And he helped his colleagues at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute carry out their experiments.
So this is not like a pure academic interest. This was, to go back to the beginning of your talk, he was pursuing these to try and ensure that the German Volk could overcome these kinds of disorders?
Well, it's hard. Yes, it's hard to, and I should have said this at the beginning. It's very, very difficult to really, with great confidence, reconstruct precisely what Mengele was doing in terms of science at Auschwitz, because there are almost no records. There are, although he kept quite careful records by all testimony, they didn't survive. We have applications to the Forschungsrat, which was the scientific research foundation or council that supported some of his research. We have some progress reports. We have the testimony of some of the German scientists who worked with him, and we have a lot of testimony from victims. But that testimony, in my view, is difficult to accept in one sense. It's difficult to accept it in terms of understanding what Mengele's research program was, because the people, both the subjects of the experiments and the inmate physicians who worked with him, were not in a position to know what his research aims were. They knew what happened to them. They could testify about what their own personal experience was, but to go the next step and say, well, this is what he was trying to do and this is what his objective was, is a leap which I'm not willing to take. In my book,
just to make a point here, because one of your tasks was, if you could find him, to bring him to justice, and to do that you needed to have meticulous evidence. It wasn't enough to say he was a rotten bastard and we all know it.
Right. But in terms of his actual criminal culpability, and we haven't talked about this yet, his service on the ramp at Auschwitz, the so-called ramp, where he made these selections between who was to be sent to their death immediately and who was to be exploited first for the labor, that there's no question about his involvement in that and about the criminality of that, and he even admitted it. So there's no question about his culpability. The issue of his research is somewhat more problematic in terms of understanding what exactly it was. We know a few of the research projects because we have better evidence about those, but in toto we don't know completely.
Auschwitz was liberated by the Soviets in January 1945. What happened to Mengele that he got away from Auschwitz?
Yeah. So he left Auschwitz in before the Soviets arrived, about a week or so before they arrived. He was last seen by some credible witnesses packing up his research notes and samples, slides, and other things into big crates, which were put in the back of a vehicle. And he and some of his colleagues left by motor car, and they went to Berlin. They went to Berlin to seek another assignment and to really figure out the lay of the land. And in Berlin, Mengele was assigned to be the chief, it was a promotion of sorts, the chief medical officer for the area around Breslau and the Gross-Rosen concentration camp.
And just a bit of background again from the book, which it highlights the Mengele perspective that what he was doing was normal in some ways. His wife went on holiday to be with him. She went to Auschwitz.
Yes. Oh, yeah. This was. We know this following story, because 5 letters were sold at auction within the last 10 or 12 years, which talk about this visit of Irene Mengele to visit her husband in late August 1944. And she was there for the dedication of a new hospital that was established there. And she was able to attend a scientific conference that Mengele was involved in, where he delivered a paper about his research at Auschwitz. And then she became ill, quite ill, and she had diphtheria, and she was nursed back to health. And Mengele then travels with her, takes her back home to Freiburg, where her parents lived, and where their then 6 or 8 month old son was living with her parents. And then he makes his way back to Auschwitz. And then there's this very interesting exchange. We don't have the exchange. We only have Mengele, Josef Mengele as part of the exchange, but we know from that, we can infer what she was writing to him. He says to her, Irene, I want you to come live here at Auschwitz with me. I want you to bring Rolf and come live with me here. I'm trying to get a transfer out of here, but it's not going to happen until next spring. So please come. And she apparently says, yes, I'll come, but I want to wait till after Christmas. And he says, no, that's too late. And he says, well, I have to get a crib for Rolf and I have to get an apartment. And he arranges all those things. And by the time she's actually able to go to live with him at Auschwitz, it's no longer possible. So you have this strange situation where within, I mean, as you say, Auschwitz was liberated in late January. She's contemplating a move to Auschwitz in mid-December 1944. It's quite odd. And we didn't know any of this before those letters appeared.
Okay, I want to skip a little bit now to, he got to South America, as did many Nazis, through Switzerland and Italy. And of course, nobody knew who he was, but that's not true, is it?
Well, he gets to Argentina under a false name, and he hooks up there with the German emigre community, and he reestablishes connections with his family. His wife's divorced him, or has not gone with him to South America. She divorces him later. He's by himself. He links up with the German emigre community, which is quite welcome in Argentina at the time. Juan Perón encouraged and created a benign environment for Nazi refugees or Nazi people who were hiding from their Nazi past. He meets Adolf Eichmann at least 2 or 3 times. He's very chary about revealing who he is. He's still quite concerned, although he has no reason to be. In the 1950s, he arrives there in 1949. In the 1950s, there was really no one looking for Nazis, not in Germany, not really anywhere. This was a period of kind of beginning of the Cold War, the rebuilding of Germany as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. There was very little interest in pursuing justice for former Nazis, and certainly not in Argentina. Mengele, who before he left Germany was on a farm as a farm worker doing heavy manual labor, is now in a cosmopolitan city that has bookstores and libraries and theater and movies. He's able to kind of recultivate the life of the mind. He's quite content, I think, although still nervous. He writes an article about genetics for a German language emigre publication. And as I say, he links up with these kind of Nazi circle of German emigres. In 1956, in 1954, his wife divorces him. He's represented by counsel in the city of Dusseldorf.
In his own name, he's not there.
In his own name, he's not there. But and that eventually leads to German judicial and police interest in him. He goes to Europe in 1956 under the false name with a false passport that is issued by the Argentines in the false name. There he meets his sister-in-law, who's a widow because his younger brother had died in 1949. They strike up a romance, probably engineered by the father to protect the family inheritance. He goes back to Argentina. She joins him there with her son, his nephew, and now they decide to marry. He becomes a stepson. They marry in Uruguay in 1958. Shortly after they get married, the German prosecutors in Freiburg, there begins to become interest in him by German police and judicial officials. They go to the hometown, this company town, and start asking about Josef Mengele. That alerts the family. The family writes to Mengele in Argentina saying, they're looking for you, son. You better watch out. Mengele decides he can no longer live in Argentina because Argentina is able to extradite people to Germany. So he decides to go to Paraguay. In the meantime, by the way, he had invested in a pharmaceutical firm in Buenos Aires, which he now has to sell his interest in. He goes to Paraguay. Through fraud, he's able to get Paraguayan naturalized citizenship. He's supposed to have been there for 5 years, but he was able to lie about that. And in May of 1959, he becomes a naturalized Paraguayan citizen. He's fine. He's under the name of Jose Mengele. He's living not quite openly, but under his own name, and he believes he's safe there. The president of Paraguay at the time is Alfredo Stroessner, who has German background. His father was German from Bavaria, and he feels pretty safe until May 1960, when the Israelis kidnap Adolf Eichmann and speared him out of Argentina, where he's to stand trial in Jerusalem. All of a sudden, Mengele understands the reason why he felt safe in Paraguay, not only because of Stroessner, but also because Paraguayans do not extradite their citizens. But now he realizes that doesn't matter, doesn't apply anymore. If the Israelis can capture and spirit Eichmann away, they can do the same to me in Paraguay. So he needs to go even further underground. He now establishes a new identity, and he goes to Brazil with the help of right-wing German emigres who help him, and of course his family, who since the time he arrives in Argentina has been supplying him with funds and support.
Is the company still going?
I think it was sold. Certainly, when I worked on the case, the company was still going. If you went to Günzburg, you saw the big name Mengele on the warehouses and stuff. But it was sold sometime in the last 20 or so years. It may still have the brand. I mean, if you go on eBay, you can find replacement parts for Mengele tractors and things like that. They had a dépendance in Indiana and New York, not far from where you were in Chicago. They were quite a big business for a while, but of course the publicity around Mengele didn't help them.
No, indeed. Now we're getting close to the end, and I do want to spend a couple of minutes on the Kennedys. But so what I'm actually recommending is that people buy your book.
That would be very nice.
To find out, anybody smiling, don't smile. Just buy a book, Alan Winthrop.
Don't go to the library and just read it. That's what I care about. Just
they should
buy it.
They've got nothing else. We ain't got anything else to do at the moment.
Right.
You have the Germans, the Israelis, and the Americans all chasing after him. Israel came very close at one point to getting him, but then missed it, partly due to a change in leadership at Mossad, as I understand from your book. Then I think, in a huge irony, it seems to me, at the end of the book, it's reported that he has died in a swimming incident, and somebody has to prove this is really Mengele, and there are loads of people out there who don't want to believe that he's dead.
Right.
I mean, I remember the feeling myself. I want that bastard caught. I want him hung, drawn, and quartered, and then given a fair trial. So I didn't want him to be dead. And there were lots of people, including the twins and the dwarfs who'd been experimented on, who wanted him alive. And you almost had to go back to Mengele's physical anthropology to take the bones. It's such an irony, his science to prove who he was.
Well, there's even a further irony. We use the actual science that he would have practiced back then. That was the technology that was available to us in 1985, because DNA had not yet developed as a forensic tool at that time. And it was the physical anthropology. You would look at I should say that what was discovered in this grave in São Paulo in 1985 was the skeletonized remains of a person who died 6 years before, in 1979. There was no soft tissue available, or very little, mostly bones, and mostly only bones, some clothing, and it had been a wet environment, not conducive to a careful forensic evaluation. So the evaluators had to really rely on old techniques: the shape of the skull, there's certain values that they would assign to things, and they were able to kind of layer a number of consistencies between what was known about the living Mengele and what one could extrapolate from the bones of this dead unknown person. And they came to the conclusion in their minds that within a so-called reasonable scientific certainty, the body was Josef Mengele's. Now, I, who was in Brazil at the time, saw all the evidence, and although I thought it was likely that it was Mengele, I decided that I would try to convince my boss back in Washington that there wasn't enough evidence yet, and that we really needed to continue the investigation. We owed it to the survivors, we owed it to history, we owed it to everything, to make sure that we had as clear a case as possible. So very quietly, I worked with colleagues and eventually then with the Germans and the Israelis to go back, look at all of the evidence that was discovered when the body was found, all of his correspondence and his diaries and all of that. And we were able to build a kind of medical picture of Mengele, but through the medical care he'd received. We went back to Brazil in 1986, very quietly, secretly. We found x-rays, we found other things that convinced me and most people that it was Mengele's, but still many people were unconvinced until DNA was developed to the point where it could
with Leicester
identify the body.
With Leicester University, yeah.
Yes, with Oxford and Leicester.
Yeah, in terms of ancient science, as it were, and for one of the questions in the chat box, I commend the book. If the answer is where was he between 49 and 79, he was moving around a lot. The trips to Europe, he didn't live in Europe. He was just going there.
See, Argentina until 58, and then Paraguay, and then in 1960 in the fall he went to Brazil.
But talking of ancient science, not only was there this bizarre measurement of bones, which was his speciality, you had to use graphologists, people who would confirm this is his handwriting, which is still a kind of somewhat reputable science, and the use of lie detectors with people who didn't really want to use them. I mean, the people around Mengele who kept him, looked after him, didn't want to do it.
That's what the Israelis used the polygraph. The Germans would not rely on it at all. And
So I want to bring this bit of the talk just to an end. There's lots of amazing stuff about looking for him, trying to find the evidence, the kind of documentation you had to go through. Were you raised in a Yiddish-speaking family, David?
I was not.
So you had to learn 1930s German and stuff. Wow. That's, I mean, going through all those documents is quite something. So I do commend the book, although it is, in many ways, the first part of it I found a very painful read. It's easy to think of racists as being ignorant thugs, but he wasn't an ignorant thug. He was an educated, blooming man. Alongside the book you referred to, Robert Lifton, Nazi Doctors, I think I heard a quote the other day that doctors were the most overrepresented profession in the SS. I said to my wife, can you imagine that 10% of your medical school became murderers and killers? That is very, very chilling. Just get quickly, where was he between 45 and 49? Sorry, he was in Germany, wasn't he?
Between 45 and 49, he was underground, false name, in a farm in Bavaria. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for sharing this story, which in some ways is very painful, as anything is about the Holocaust, and the evasion of justice by this murderer. How do you end up, just for the last 2-3 minutes, how on earth do you end up with the Kennedy papers? And who did it? No mucking around, David. Who did it?
So let me explain how I got involved with the Kennedy assassination. I applied for a job. I saw an advertisement, but after the Oliver Stone film in 1990, I think that's when it came out. At the end of the film, it says the U.S. government has classified all the records of the Kennedy assassination until 2057. Write your congressman. And so the way politics works, there was this huge public outcry that the records relating to Kennedy assassination should be open. So the Congress set up a special commission composed of 5 citizens, independent citizens, representing different professional organizations, the American Bar Association, the American Historical Association, and then gave it a budget of several $millions to declassify, to locate, declassify, and make available to the American public or to anyone all of the records of the Kennedy assassination, very broadly defined.
So that was like 6 pieces of paper?
Yeah. So I was the staff director. I was the first person hired. I had to hire a professional staff, establish offices, and we were given 3 years to do the work. I always said that the process was much more interesting than the product. We were able to, our biggest clients were the CIA, the military, the state, the Secret Service, NSA, the entire intelligence community, FBI, and they had to, through an unfunded mandate, turn over any record we wanted to see, and we were allowed. What made this interesting, and this is an important point, so I'll make it, was that normally in America, and I think the same may be true in Britain, our Freedom of Information Act gives to the agencies the authority to declassify something and open it up, and the public has recourse only through the courts. They can appeal a decision by the agencies. In the case of an assassination record that we would define, the record was presumed to be open, and the agencies had the obligation to appeal to my board to keep it closed. So it changes the whole, flips the valence, and creates a lot of very interesting political issues. So we worked very, very hard. We opened up a lot of records, and you're going to ask me who killed Kennedy.
I am. Who killed Kennedy?
Yeah.
Come on.
Lee Harvey Oswald.
I was curious as I was thinking about it last night. Is Jack Ruby still alive, or was he dead?
No, he died. He died in prison. Yeah.
Yeah.
He died in prison of cancer, and he was an odd duck.
Yeah, just to remind people who weren't around at the time, Jack Ruby actually killed Lee Harvey Oswald. As he was being taken into custody or something? Or
no, as he was being transferred from the Dallas County Jail to another jail, city jail to the county jail. In
the context of modern politics and conspiracy theories, everything about this Kennedy assassination, from the fact that Oswald was in Minsk, which is close to our heart because we twinned our community with the Jewish community of Minsk many years ago.
We actually went. I went to Minsk with my board to look at the KGB files there.
So you've had an interest. So you've had an interesting time. You're now retired, and you go out and you're playing golf.
I'm not retired. Are you? That's
what are you doing, David?
I'm the president of Leo Baeck Institute, New York, Berlin. So I'm doing that, which is a lay leader position. I work as a judge for the claims conference in adjudicating appeals to the decisions about compensation. I'm on 4 other not-for-profit boards, and I'm writing another book. So I'm busier than I've ever been. Okay,
so there's 2 things. Number one, one of the people online, Carol Hart, does a lot of stuff with the claims conference, so she's going to come straight after you for some requests for help for people. Good luck. Okay. What are you writing a book on?
A guy named Putzi Hamstengel. Some people may have heard of him.
Runs off the tongue. Just in 10 seconds, who was he?
Well, the book is actually about a secret wartime intelligence project that was run out of the White House, where they took Hamstengel, who was a half American, half German, early friend and supporter of Hitler's. Who ended up he was interned by the Brits when the war started in 1939, sent to Canada in a POW camp, and was brought to Washington to advise Roosevelt on what was happening within the Nazi inner circle. That's quite an interesting story.
Okay, so the very last sentence in your book is from your wife. She is, as I know, as relieved as I am to get Josef Mengele out of our home, and you brought somebody else in instead.
Yeah, but this guy's not. There's no Mengele.
No, okay. David, I would like to thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.
For giving up your time at the beginning of the day, getting rounds of applause all over the place. And I just wanted to thank you and wish you well.
Thank you very much, David.
In your many careers that you've got.
Yeah.
And we look forward to the book. Goodbye, everybody. Have a safe evening. Stay well. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Very good.